Welcome, everyone, to the onpoli podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, are Donald Trump's threatened tariffs enough justification for an early election? The Premier hints they are. The opposition sure doesn't think so.
Did moving ServiceOntario locations to Staples stores save the province money? The Financial Accountability Office doesn't think so.
What are you going to do with your $200 check from Doug Ford? One group has an idea.
And in your column, my column, I will look at the rise of big nuclear power in Ontario.
And I'm going to focus on one of Canada's premiers who's surprising a lot of people with his strength on the national stage right now. Guess who?
It's Friday, January 17th, 2025, so let's get to it.
Partner?
Oh, sir.
Little sugar to get us started? Okay, you know, I'm here this week with another Sudbury dinner jacket on.
Yes.
And thought I was going to be very impressive. In doing so, I have to say right off the top, in fact, we may just throw the script out today. I think for the next half an hour, I want to just rave about that fantastic shirt you are wearing today. For those of you who are listening on podcast, I'm telling you, it is worth going to YouTube just to check out what McGrath is wearing today, because that on a scale of 10 is a 2,459. Star Trek.
Yes.
Star Trek Palooza, just fantastic.
Yes, so this is another Christmas gift from my wife. But yes, Star Trek, you can see we've got a lot of the series represented here. We've got a Borg cube, we've got the Enterprise, Deep Space Nine, we've got them all.
The original Enterprise, not
yes.
to be confused with
And
Enterprise D, which is
off
further
camera,
down.
But the Enterprise D is on there as well, yes.
I'm telling you, Vicky, you hit it out of the ballpark. That is fantastic. That is just, wow.
Yeah, no, big Star Trek and Star Wars fans in my household.
Now, I'm afraid we have to go from the sublime to the ridiculous now.
Yes.
You ready? Here we go.
All right.
There is a group known as the Council of the Federation. Sounds like it could come out of Star Trek, actually.
It does, actually.
Council of the Federation. This is essentially the group of Canada's premiers and territorial leaders as well.
I believe so, yes.
Okay. They have been speaking with one voice quite well over the last several weeks as it relates to the response to Donald Trump's threatened tariffs and what Canada might do, and how the provinces obviously ought to encourage the federal government to respond. Until now, I am trying to imagine how Doug Ford reacted, and he is the chair of the Federation right now. It rotates. He's in the chair right now. I am trying to imagine that behind closed doors private meeting when the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, said to him, everybody else is signing this thing, but I'm not gonna. I am the lone wolf on this. We are going, Alberta is, in its own direction. Can you imagine Doug Ford's reaction?
Having seen Doug Ford react in public when he was upset before, even before his provincial political career, I have some idea of what it might have sounded like. The inciting incident here, if you want to put it that way, was this statement that the 10 premiers and the Prime Minister all signed, and what Smith seems to have wanted was a clear disavowal from the federal government that any response to Trump tariffs would not include any kind of export controls on Alberta oil and gas. The federal government is not willing to disavow that idea yet. There is a scenario that people are kicking around where the new President Trump next week imposes tariffs on Canada on everything except oil and gas, because that would raise gas prices and energy prices in the U.S. And Canada wants to retain some ability to say, well, no, you don't get to have it both ways. In any case, because the federal government is not willing to disavow that entirely, Smith refused to sign this joint statement and is the one lone holdout in this statement.
I would make one compare and contrast statement following up on what you just said here, and that is I want to go back, as I occasionally do here, I want to go back about 35 years to the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord negotiations. And I remember Premier David Peterson, who represented Ontario at those negotiations, saying to me, Steve, you cannot believe what's happening in that room. The Premier of Alberta, who obviously is not going to get reelected if he doesn't go to bat for the oil patch, and if he's too sweet on Quebec, he's going to have a problem as well. Don Getty, he was talking about. He's saying the most wonderful pro-Canada things. He is prepared to expend political currency in the interests of the entire country. That was a different time. Yeah. It seems that everybody, I shouldn't say everybody, it seems clearly this Alberta Premier is being much more parochial and focused on her narrow provincial interest as opposed to taking the big picture here. Yeah. And I don't know, maybe that's good for local politics in Alberta. But I bet you Don Getty wouldn't be thrilled, and I bet you Peter Lougheed wouldn't be thrilled, and maybe Ralph Klein and a few other premiers who, when push came to shove, were able to take the national view on these things.
Different times, unfortunately.
Different times is right. And with that, we're off to issue 1. We have got the strongest indication yet that an early election is coming to Ontario. Premier Doug Ford was at the Royal Ontario Museum answering a question from 680 News' Richard Southern about Liberal leader Bonnie Crombie, NDP leader Marit Stiles, and incoming President Donald Trump's tariff threats. Here is what Ford had to say.
If you can see cross-party support, does that negate the reason for an early election right now?
Well, let's look at it this way. Nothing's been decided. Let's see where the tariffs go.
So it sounds as if Trump does put in place the tariffs, you're going to the polls. Is that fair to say, Premier?
Well, let's take a look at what happens on January 20th or 21st, and all depends on what sort of tariffs he's putting in there.
Okay, to my ears, that very much sounded like a test-run explanation Ford intends to give when he calls an early election. We're all getting tips on this, right?
Yeah.
The last tip I got, literally this morning, was an election call the last week of January for the third week in February. So literally a week after Donald Trump becomes president. And the explanation is going to be, I need a renewed majority, this is what the Premier is going to say, and a new mandate to face down Donald Trump and his awful tariff threats. That sounds like the argument the Premier is going to put. What about the opposition? What are they saying?
Well, the opposition parties are opposing. They don't agree that the government needs any new mandate, right? The government has a very large majority in the legislature. Both NDP leader Marit Stiles and Bonnie Crombie have emphasized that there's no need for a new election for the government to implement any kind of new measures, and that the government can pass whatever they want. They have also said that they are willing to work with the government on any new kind of a spending package, right? Marit Stiles issued a statement from Windsor earlier this week where she said, of course we will work with the government to protect Ontario jobs. Crombie said as much as well. Actually, we're going to go to Crombie here right now. We used to do a quote of note segment on this podcast. We're going to give Crombie the quote of note here for something she said on Monday.
Doug Ford wants to abandon his post. He wants to abandon his duties as Premier while facing the biggest battle our province has seen in a very long time. And yet he wants an election. Because quite frankly, all he cares about is his own job. He cares more about clinging to power than he does about you and your family. In the military, this kind of thing would get you a court-martial for dereliction of duty.
Yikes.
It's tough talk.
Yeah, tough talk indeed. Do you notice on the platform there, it doesn't say Ontario Liberals?
No.
Team Bonnie.
Yep.
Because to be a Liberal in Canada today
You're
might not be the thing you want to promote.
Swimming against the tide.
There you go. That's a nice way to put it. Now, let's talk timing here. MPPs, of course, are supposed to return to Queen's Park at the beginning of March. They're on a winter break right now. But that assumes that they're not going to be out campaigning on the hustings in the interim as they look to reclaim their seats. So that could all be off. And remember, I think we also have to put this on the record. Part of the reason that Ford may want to go early, and there are lots of reasons, take advantage of his high polling numbers, get out from underneath the Greenbelt investigation, which the RCMP may report back next year in time for the regularly scheduled election call. But the Liberals, look at the Liberals. They are going to be very focused on the federal Liberal leadership race, which will pick a new leader on Sunday, March the 9th. So theoretically around the same time that an Ontario election could be happening. So that is a lot of people power that Bonnie Crombie might be counting on to help her in an Ontario election campaign that will not be there because, of course, they're going to be focused on trying to elect the next Prime Minister of Canada. So that's all part of the home court advantage you enjoy when you are the party in power.
Now, we asked her about that on Monday, and she did say that she is, in fact, seeing federal Liberals, not MPs necessarily, but people who are sympathetic to the federal Liberal cause are starting to express interest in the Ontario Liberal Party. That is, of course, the kind of thing a leader says in this kind of context, but I thought it was noteworthy. Aside from the federal Liberal leadership race, Ford also probably doesn't want to wait too late in the year because, of course, we assume after the federal Liberal race is done, there will be a federal election shortly thereafter. And then Ford's own party will be competing for talent and money with Pierre Poilievre's Conservative Party federally, right? A lot of Ontario political activists and donors they are going to have to choose, how they split their time between provincial and federal politics. And to be blunt about it, some of these people are going to be looking for jobs in Ottawa after the next election.
Right on. And I mean, the fact is, there's only so much money to go around. There are only so many candidates to go around. There's only so much platform to go around. There's only so much oxygen in the political atmosphere to go around. So you definitely want to capitalize when you can.
Well, and it reminds me of something that we saw, the dynamic in 2015 after Justin Trudeau won, where a whole lot of Ontario Liberal staff and I mean, some candidates ended up in the Federal House of Commons, and people working for MPs there or working in the various government offices there. There was a caravan of buses going from Toronto to Ottawa for a few months there after the federal election.
So many that somebody at Queen's Park said to me, you know what, all the good people, the A team, have all gone to Ottawa. I wish we had the B team here. We've actually got the C and D team. That's what they said. Those aren't my words, but
Yes.
That was the kind of thing that was being said at the time. Okay, and with that, we're off to issue 2. Last year, the province announced it was moving some ServiceOntario locations into Staples Canada locations. Obviously, a public service organization moving into a private company's space. The government said this 3-year pilot project would save the public $900,000. But the Financial Accountability Office has crunched the numbers, and they disagree. They say the move will actually cost taxpayers more money. What do we know here?
Right. So the FAO issued this report. They were actually asked to do this report by Liberal MPP Stephanie Bowman, who's the party's finance critic. They looked at the numbers. There were 9 ServiceOntario locations that were relocated for what the government is calling a pilot program. The FAO has found that if the province had retained the original operators with the same service levels, it would have cost the province $10.9 million. In the actual fact, moving the ServiceOntario locations to these Staples locations ended up costing $11.7 million. So about $800,000 more to move these locations to Staples than it would have cost in the original configuration.
So we have competing numbers here. We have on the one hand a minister of the Crown saying, here's how much I think it's going to cost. And we have an independent, nonpartisan parliamentary body saying, no, we disagree. We think it's going to cost this much. Whose numbers do we believe?
Well, so the FAO actually does break down the numbers a bit more, with a bit more nuance, if I can put it that way. So they one of the really key factors here to keep in mind is that the new Staples locations were actually open longer. They operated for longer hours, and I believe they offered some services that the previous locations did not. So that increased the costs to the government. The government is still obviously having to pay Staples some money for hosting these locations. So they provided 2 alternative scenarios. One where the ServiceOntario location simply stayed in the existing locations, and one where the government, where those locations had to expand their hours and offer more services. What they found, in essence, is that if the government had wanted to expand the services the way they have with these Staples locations, under the old model, that would have actually cost a bit more than $12 million. So compared to that counterfactual, the Staples option, if you want to put it that way, has actually saved the government something like $1 million. So it is one of these cases where you can pull either answer from the report depending on what you want. Unsurprisingly, the opposition parties who were critical of this move from the beginning are leaning more towards that first explanation, that this has in fact simply cost the government more than the original situation did. This report has not changed anybody's minds. Liberal finance critic Stephanie Bowman has called it another insider deal for the friends of this government. That, of course, is a theme that the opposition parties have really been banging away at for the last little while.
Well, let me take and I'm just throwing this out there to be devil's advocate. We'll take a more charitable view of this. This is a progressive conservative government. Traditionally, progressive conservative governments, if a service being offered can be offered by the private sector, I'm not even saying more cheaply, just can be offered by the private sector and doesn't have to be offered by the public sector. That's the option they generally prefer to choose. Does that seem to be what's happening in this case?
I think that there's certainly some of that. I would also add that we are seeing a lot of retail operators struggle with just getting foot traffic. And I think one thing that might appeal to the government here is that retailers like Staples, not just them by any means, have a lot more square footage these days than they necessarily have products to move because so many people are shopping online, right? We all got used to ordering off of Amazon during the pandemic. And so for a retailer like Staples or like other retailers, they might really welcome the idea of actually, we have the square footage in the stores that we're not using or not using as well. And if the government wants to set up shop there and people can get their health cards and driver's licenses there instead of having to go to some other specific location, maybe that's a win-win.
Gotcha. And with that, we're off to issue 3. Sometime in February, everyone in Ontario will receive a $200 check in the mail from the Treasurer of Ontario. The government calls it a tax rebate that Doug Ford says will help Ontarians during this cost of living crisis. But one group is saying that this money could be put to better use by Ontarians, and they have started a website to promote this idea. Okay, what's the 411 on the 200 here?
So there is a website called $200.ca, which is calling on Ontarians to donate their checks to an organization of their choosing, a charitable organization. In total, Ontarians will receive $3 billion through this plan. That's what it costs when you give $15 million, 15 million people rather, $200 each. So, obviously, one way for this money to be spent is for people to go buy themselves, new TVs at Costco or whatever. But it might be, let's say, more socially optimal if that money went to food banks or homeless shelters, those kinds of services that could use the money.
Well, of course, if you live in the city of Toronto, where the proposed budget increase is 6.9%, you can take that $200 that you got from the province of Ontario and just make your check out to Olivia Chow because you're going to be passing it from one government to the next.
Yes.
Having said that, there's nothing new under the sun. I remember, I don't know what it is, 30 years ago when the Mike Harris government did this exact same thing. They handed out $200 checks to the public, not terribly long before an election campaign, if I recall. And some people thought back then the same thing they are thinking now. This is a ridiculous use of money. There are lots of people who will get this check who don't need it. And a lot of people donated their checks to charities as a form of protest. So we've been here before, haven't we?
Right. But there are some differences. I mean, the rebate in the Harris era was in part the result of a surplus, right? The provincial government was, I think if I remember correctly, Harris and the finance minister, Ernie Eves of the day, called it like an unanticipated surplus. And this was a way for them to give taxpayers back money that the government did not need.
It's like a dividend check.
Right, exactly. This is now a different context, right? The Ontario government is in deficit, and a pretty substantial deficit. And the insofar as we are seeing any kind of windfall provincially, it's actually because of changes to the federal capital gains tax, which also this week Pierre Poilievre has pledged to reverse. So just that came out this week as well. So Ontario is expecting roughly $3 billion from those capital gains tax changes, and so that's kind of. It would be a bit too simplistic to say that's where this money is coming from, right? But it's certainly helping.
We do spend a lot of time on this podcast talking about people taking money out of one pocket and putting it into another pocket. Feels that way anyway.
And it is, to go back to the first segment, I mean, it is also relevant to election timing, right? I dealt with a lot of people who were certain that an election call was going to come this week, and unless something changes between taping and airing, the election is not happening.
Bite your tongue.
Yeah, exactly. But I am of the opinion that they are not going to call the election until at least somebody has an actual one of these checks in their hands. So
that sounds like a good bet. And with that, we're off to your column, my column. You know it, you love it. It's our regular feature. We call it Your Column, My Column, in which JMM and I reminisce about the columns we wrote for our TVO website over the past week. What do you like to pluck out of your quiver this time?
Right. So this is my most recent column for the website. The government announced this week that they are exploring with the local First Nation and with Port Hope Council. They are exploring the possibility of building a new large nuclear station at the Wesleyville site in Port Hope. The Wesleyville power plant site. It was an oil-fired power plant that was supposed to come online in 1970. Folks who know the history will know that's a really bad time to build an oil-fired power plant. The oil shocks of the 70s made it a totally derelict power plant. I'm not sure if it even ever delivered a single watt
Don't
of
think
power.
so, no.
But first Ontario Hydro and now OPG held on to the land for decades and decades, and now they are saying it's the perfect place to build a new nuclear power plant, and they are thinking big. 8,000 to 10,000 megawatts of nuclear power to deliver to Ontario's grid. There's huge concerns, particularly in the long term, about delivering the electricity that we're going to need by, say, 2040, 2050. And particularly if it gets to the higher end of that range, to 10,000 megawatts, that would be not just the largest nuclear plant currently in Ontario, it would be one of the largest in the world. And so that's notable on its own, but I think it's also noteworthy because the only new nuclear power plant we are building right now is at Darlington, where we are. Ontario was an early adopter for what are called small modular reactors, right? The idea that instead of building these giant mega projects, we're going to build small reactors that we can build quickly and permit and do all these things faster and ideally more cheaply. And given the way the wind is blowing right now, I feel like what's being built at Darlington, at least in Ontario anyway, that might be the only small modular reactor we ever see built. Now, part of the business case has always been that we might be able to sell this technology, or we could be a proving ground for technology that could be useful elsewhere. But the government seems to have been intrigued by the idea of small modular reactors, and now is like, you know what, we like the big modular reactors instead. How about you, Steve?
Good enough. Well, okay, can I do a little Q&A with you here?
Okay.
Humor me if you will.
Absolutely.
What do you notice about the state of politics in the nation's capital these days?
A little bit of a power vacuum, I would say.
A little bit of a power vacuum?
Okay, a big vacuum.
Okay, correct. What does nature abhor?
If I remember correctly, it abhors a vacuum.
Correct again. Who has moved to fill that power vacuum?
With this one, somebody familiar to both of us, the Premier of Ontario.
I think you're batting 1,000 here. Okay, that's what my column is about. Ontario premiers traditionally play a role on the national stage. And we can go back to, well, you could go back 150 years, but let's just go back in my lifetime. John Robarts held the Confederation of Tomorrow conference on the top floor of the TD Centre in 1967. He wanted to look at what was happening to our country 100 years after Confederation. Bill Davis, go fast forward 15 years or so, became sort of a modern-day father of Confederation by helping Pierre Trudeau repatriate the Constitution with an accompanying Charter of Rights and Freedoms. David Peterson was there to help negotiate the Meech Lake Constitutional Accord. Bob Rae, again, taking a leadership role in the Charlottetown Accord negotiations. Doug Ford has been Premier for 6.5 years and has really not, until now, made a meaningful impact on the national stage. But, and this is what the gist of my column is about, he's meeting the moment. This is a moment where, because of the vacuum federally, we need political leaders to move in and fill it, and particularly with all of the threats from down south about to hit our shores, we need significant political leadership in this country right now. And Doug Ford, whether you like him or whether you don't, is moving to fill that vacuum. Now, he did something interesting and noteworthy this past week. He went out there in a baseball cap at one of his press conferences. Yes. And no, it was not a red cap saying "Make America Great Again." It was a blue cap, well, with a different slogan. Let's take a look.
Well, first of all, I'll talk about the hat that I'm wearing. You don't see me in the hats too much. But this is about everyday Canadians standing up for the country. This is an example of how we need to unite. And we cannot let President Trump divide us.
Now, this was just apparently a mom-and-pop operation that decided to create this hat. It said, for those listening on podcast and didn't see it, Canada is not for sale. Same font, same type as Make America Great Again. People may remember Doug Ford's first year in office in 2018. It was a disaster. You may not believe that this is the same guy, But the fact is, he's been one of the very few politicians in a position of authority in this country who has been prepared to push back on this. I was going to use a bad word there, but let's just say on this nonsense.
Safe for families.
Right. This nonsense of Canada becoming a 51st state, of which there is no interest in this country and ought not to be south of the border. So if my email inbox is any indication, and if my social media feeds are any indication, Doug Ford is getting good notices for filling that vacuum.
I have to say, I mean, there's always a danger in our jobs of getting disconnected from the actual public sentiment out there. We necessarily don't always have our thumbs right on the pulse, if I can put it that way.
I think the bad expression used is we drink each other's bathwater.
Yes.
Which we don't want to do.
And yet, I have actually been surprised at the number of people, and I'm just talking about like when I'm out in the world, just in the last week, you strike up a conversation with somebody and people are, oh, hey, what do you do? Oh, I work for the TVO. I cover provincial politics, and people just volunteering to me, like, boy, not a huge fan of Doug Ford, but lately he's been really good. Like, and that's always the way it is phrased, right? Somebody who says to me, like, not the guy's biggest fan, but and that is a real thing I am seeing among. I want to use the word normal people, not just weirdos like us.
Yeah. This is not to take away from Elizabeth May, the leader of the Greens, who has spoken forcefully about this. Charlie Angus, Timmins James Bay MP for the New Democratic Party. Jagmeet Singh's had a couple of things to say about this for the NDP. But again, no disrespect to them, they're not decision makers. They're not in positions of authority the way Doug Ford is. So I think it's different when the premier of the biggest province in the country comes out and says something, the likes of which he has been saying. And with that, let's get off to our mailbag here. If you've got a burning question or insightful comment, we always love to hear from you at onpolitics@tvo.org. JMM, what do we got up this week?
So we have a question from Stephen Lee in Brampton, who writes, hello, Steve and John Michael. Before Prime Minister Justin Trudeau resigned, I was talking to a colleague about the situation in Ottawa. I explained that the Liberal caucus does not have the power to unseat someone as leader of the party, and that the decision was exclusively in the hands of the Liberal leader. Once I said that, something struck me. If the Liberal Party has no mechanism to quickly force a leader out, what would happen if the Liberal leader was incapacitated? For example, when Woodrow Wilson was president in the United States, he suffered a stroke, but remained in the White House with the governing controlled by those close to him. The Deputy Prime Minister is not constitutionally empowered the same way a Vice President is to assume the duties if a head of government is incapacitated. This seems unnecessarily risky to me, to have the federal government be paralyzed in the event of an emergency. Let me know if I'm wrong. I would love to hear your thoughts. Stephen Lee in Brampton, Ontario.
Stephen, that is a great question. And just, apropos of what you just said about Woodrow Wilson being felled by a stroke, it wasn't his closest government advisors who were running the government of the day. It was his wife, Edith Wilson, who ostensibly was in charge and giving people the impression that, yes, Woodrow's on the case, when in fact she was on the case. Anything. I mean,
imagine her like forging his signature and stuff.
Yeah, we didn't find that out until years later, but that is the case. Look, as for the Canadian Prime Minister, this topic was batted about during the COVID-19 pandemic. What if the PM got too sick to do his job or had to be put into a, God forbid, induced coma because of COVID? What then? I must say, I did not cover, despite what you might think, I did not cover Sir John A. Macdonald's government. But I don't think this has ever happened before in the history of our country where, a prime minister has the job but is so incapacitated he can't do the job. I don't know. You got anything on this?
So my understanding is that this was something that perhaps unsurprisingly got taken very seriously during the Cold War, and the thought that, there could be a nuclear strike on Ottawa and suddenly you need to ensure the continuity of government. And so there is, in the federal government today, there is an order in council, which is an instrument that, written by cabinet and signed by the Governor General, that lists the ministers who are supposed to replace the prime minister if they become incapacitated or unable to do their job. And it also lists replacements for each cabinet minister. So if the Minister of Finance needs to be replaced, actually, that did have to happen recently. There are 3 ministers who are named as potential successors. So currently, the Deputy Prime Minister is Dominic LeBlanc, who is also the finance minister. He is not the person who is next in line to be prime minister if, as we say, God forbid, something were to fell Justin Trudeau. That would be Lawrence Macaulay, the Minister of Agriculture and Agri-Food, who would assume the responsibilities of the prime minister. the Library of Parliament says that you're correct. There has never been a case of the Prime Minister being incapacitated. PMs only cease to hold the office. They historically have only ever left office either voluntarily. They have said to the Governor General, this person will succeed me, or they've lost an election, and that's maybe less voluntary if we want to put it that way. There is precedent for what happens if the Prime Minister dies. Right? Prime Ministers have died in office. Sir John A. Macdonald and Sir John Thompson died while in office. I'm actually blanking. I did not realize there was a John Thompson.
John Thompson. Okay, remember, MacDonald dies in office, and then there are a series of, I think, 4 prime ministers who succeed him, and they all serve for very short periods of time. Right. Christopher Plummer's grandfather, you know the actor Christopher Plummer? Sir John Abbott. He was one of those 4.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there's Mackenzie Bowell. There's Charles Tupper was the last one, shortest-serving PM of all time. But John Thompson is a fascinating story because he went over to visit Queen Victoria, had lunch with her, had a heart attack, and fell in his soup and died right there.
Good Lord.
And I've been to his gravesite in Halifax. It's actually quite an impressive gravesite. But we have had 2 prime ministers leave office by virtue of death.
Yes.
MacDonald and Thompson. There are other ways that it could happen.
Yes.
Because remember, those 2 examples I gave are back in the 1890s. The other way that a prime minister could leave office prematurely is if the Governor General dismisses the Prime Minister. Now, that hasn't happened in Canada in a very long time. It did happen in my lifetime, maybe not your lifetime,
no,
but
mine.
It did happen in a Commonwealth country in my lifetime where the Prime Minister of Australia 50 years ago was turfed from office because the Governor General technically has the power to do that, right?
Yes. This was a crisis in Australia. I'm trying to remember what the exact details were, but it was like a deadlocked parliament between the lower and upper house. In Australia, both houses of parliament are elected. And so if elections go weird, you can get some very fun events. And it was clear that the Prime Minister of the day could not get a working majority in both houses, could not get the government policy implemented. But there was this question of does the Governor General actually have the moral authority to do this? The legal and constitutional authority is clear.
Yes.
But it was a scandal when the Governor General of Australia did this. He dismissed the Prime Minister, appointed a caretaker. There were elections subsequently. They returned up, let's say, a more normal parliament, and but then the Governor General left the country. Resigned, left the country, and it was. I think it's fair to say it was seen as extraordinary. It might have been necessary, but still controversial to this day. And I mean, there's a reason why Australia is one of those Commonwealth countries that is more prominently talking about becoming a republic.
Yes.
So
this is not such a crazy idea for Canada, in as much as you remember when the convoy took over Ottawa, and you remember one of their demands.
Yes.
Their demands when they came to Ottawa were, we want a meeting with the Governor General because we want the Governor General to dismiss the Prime Minister. So technically, that wasn't such a crazy request because legally, constitutionally, that can happen. Morally, ethically, normally, today, no.
I think in 2025, pardon me, the monarchy only makes sense. The monarchy only works in a basic sort of democratic way if the rule is in almost every case the Governor General should do what the Prime Minister says. And that flows down to provincial politics, where I think we are likely to see somebody argue that the Lieutenant Governor should refuse Doug Ford's request for a dissolution in an election. I'm just predicting I will see that argument made somewhere on social media.
And it will go absolutely nowhere.
And properly, right?
Yeah.
The Lieutenant Governor should take the direction of her First Minister under almost every circumstance, and the number of circumstances in which the monarchy should interfere directly in elected politics is vanishingly small.
Right on. Give the email address, would you, my friend?
Right. If you want to ask about any of the content on our show, you can email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
And that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, January 17th, 2025.
You can follow our show on Apple Podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available. And you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're located.
This week's episode was produced and edited by Matthew O'Mara, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Our managing editor is Katie O'Connor. Lori Few is the executive producer of Digital. John Ferry is vice president, programming and content.
Special thanks to our wonderful crew for making this podcast happen in our studio, and we're running late, so we're going to get out of here. Until next Friday, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.